In the spring of 1997, Lincoln introduced the Navigator as a 1998 model, becoming the first major American manufacturer to offer a full-size body-on-frame luxury SUV at scale. Contemporary road tests compared its interior quality directly to the Range Rover, a vehicle that cost significantly more, and in many of those comparisons, the Navigator came out ahead. For roughly 18 months, Lincoln had the segment to itself. Then, Cadillac arrived, not with a better engineered vehicle, but with a faster decision. The first Escalade was developed in less than a year, based on a rebadged GMC Yukon Denali, and by the time it reached showrooms, it produced less horsepower than the Navigator. By every objective engineering measure, Lincoln was ahead, but by the metrics that would define the next phase of the market, it was already falling behind. It raises a simple question. What happens when you win on engineering, but fail to recognize where the competition is actually happening? To understand that, you have to look at how Lincoln built the Navigator and what Cadillac chose to build in response. Since 1987, the Range Rover had occupied something American manufacturers had not figured out how to challenge. A full-size, genuinely sophisticated luxury vehicle built on a truck platform instead of a sedan. But that dominance came at a cost. The Range Rover was British engineering at British pricing, $55,000 to $70,000 in the mid-1990s, for a vehicle that, while undeniably capable, remained distant from the instincts of the American luxury buyer. Lincoln saw an opening in that contradiction. The demand was real. Range Rover's sustained sales confirmed it, but the demand was not unlimited. American luxury buyers, the ones who owned Lincoln Town Cars and filled the company's revenue, wanted something different. They wanted full-size luxury, yes, but they wanted it built by Ford. They wanted it at a price that did not require justifying the purchase as an exotic import. They wanted to feel American while feeling elevated. Ford's position made this possible. The F-Series truck line generated enormous profit. The Explorer dominated the midsize SUV segment. The company had both financial security and the platform infrastructure to take a calculated risk. And Lincoln's brief was straightforward. Take Ford's brand new 1997 generation F-150 architecture, the platform underlying the new Expedition that was launching simultaneously, and use it to build something that felt like luxury instead of utility. This timing detail matters more than it sounds. The Navigator was not adapted from an existing platform after Ford's engineering was finished. Lincoln had access to the new F-150 architecture as it was being developed. The company designed the Navigator on the cutting-edge platform, simultaneously with the truck's own engineering, not as an afterthought. That simultaneous development meant the Navigator got the newest innovations from its first production year rather than inheriting yesterday's platform dressed up in leather. The new platform was a substantial engineering independent departure. Independent front suspension replaced 32 years of twin I-beam design, a Ford full-size truck front suspension philosophy that dated back to 1965. Hydroformed front frame rails arrived for the first time. The cab architecture was new. By the standards of the late 1990s American truck engineering, the 1997 F-150 platform was the most significant single update Ford's full-size truck program had received in decades. The Navigator inherited all of it from day one. A buyer purchasing a 1998 Navigator was driving a vehicle whose underpinnings represented the leading edge of American truck engineering at the moment of its introduction. The platform sharing strategy was not pragmatism disguised as limitation. It was the actual brilliant part. The Navigator did not need its own chassis. Ford was engineering a new full-size truck platform with independent front suspension, hydro-formed frame rails, and contemporary structure. Lincoln did not need to reinvent any of that. What Lincoln needed was differentiation, a Lincoln-specific grille, interior materials that felt substantial, leather quality that justified the price, sound-dampening treatments in the cabin, and suspension tuning that prioritized comfort over sportiness. Those engineering choices transformed a truck platform into a statement about American luxury. The pricing sealed the entire strategy. The Navigator launched at approximately $41,000 to $44,000. The Range Rover occupied $55,000 to $70,000. That gap was roughly the cost of a new Mustang GT, or a second vehicle, or a small boat. And it was the complete market opportunity. Lincoln was offering interior quality comparable to vehicles costing $20,000 more, while asking significantly less than the Range Rover charged. Lincoln's own press materials explicitly framed the comparison against the Range Rover, rather than against domestic competitors, signaling exactly where the company believed the Navigator belonged in the hierarchy. Car and driver and motor trend tests confirmed the framing was accurate. The market understood immediately. This was not a truck wearing nice upholstery. This was a luxury statement that happened to be built on a truck platform. The Navigator sold strongly from day one, attracting exactly the buyers Lincoln had identified. People who wanted full-size luxury, but wanted it from a domestic manufacturer at a price that made sense. For roughly 18 months, the Navigator essentially owned this space alone. No domestic competitor had moved to challenge it. The segment was Lincoln's to define, and the company had written the rules. The Navigator's engineering choices exposed Lincoln's actual hierarchy of values. Every decision the company made reflected a single conviction. Interior luxury and ride comfort mattered more than raw acceleration. Everything else flowed from that choice. The air rear suspension exemplified this philosophy perfectly. The Navigator came standard with pneumatic air springs at the rear axle, a system that automatically adjusted to maintain consistent ride height under load. The Expedition, its platform sibling built on the same line, used conventional coil springs as base equipment. That difference meant something real. Load the Navigator with cargo or passengers, and the suspension kept the vehicle level and composed. The ride remained isolated from the road. This was not a performance feature. It was a refinement feature. It told buyers that this vehicle understood what luxury felt like when you are driving something large. The sound deadening received the same investment priority. Lincoln's service manual specifically itemized acoustic damping panels and insulation materials installed in the Navigator at floor farsole and door locations that were absent from the Expedition's equivalent specification. These were not marketing claims. They were documented engineering specifications, distinct between two vehicles built on the same platform at the same assembly plant, Ford's Michigan truck plant in Wayne, Michigan, where Navigators and Expeditions rolled down the same lines with different components installed at the Lincoln-specific stations. The materials were not cheap. They represented engineering investment in an experience most drivers would only notice as absence, the road noise that would not be there. At 70 miles per hour on a highway, the Navigator felt isolating in a way the Expedition did not. It felt quiet. It felt like you were inside a sophisticated space that happened to have wheels. Quiet. But the engine told a different story. The 1997 and 1998 Navigator used a 5.4-liter single overhead cam Triton V8, producing 230 horsepower. That was the same output as the Ford Expedition's available 5.4-liter engine. It was actually less than what fully optioned F-150 work trucks could approach in the same year with optional packages. Here was a luxury vehicle priced $41,000 to $44,000. Premium positioning, luxury materials, the entire refinement strategy, offering no performance advantage over a cheaper platform sibling and barely keeping pace with utilitarian trucks. This was not an oversight. It was a documented engineering trade-off. Lincoln's engineering team knew what they were sacrificing. The brief was explicit: refinement not acceleration, quality not performance. Road testers in 1997 and 1998 did not hide their confusion. Car and driver and motor trend praised the Navigator's interior relentlessly. They confirmed the ride quality was superior to the Expedition. They documented that the quietness was genuine, but then they reported the performance numbers, 0 to 60 in over 9 seconds. The power-to-weight ratio was marginal for a vehicle at this price point. They questioned the logic without criticizing the truck itself. The Navigator's position was coherent up to a point. The buyers who wanted this vehicle in 1998 did not need aggressive acceleration. They wanted a large, comfortable, sophisticated space on wheels. The Navigator delivered that completely. The market validated the choice immediately. For 18 months, Lincoln's philosophy worked because the market wanted exactly what the Navigator offered. But the power deficit created an opening. It established what the Navigator was not. And someone was watching the sales numbers, calculating what buyers might want if they had a different option. In late 1997, Cadillac's John Smith made a decision that surprised the industry. Cadillac was not going to develop a luxury SUV thoughtfully over 5 years. The company did not have 5 years. Internal politics inside General Motors had blocked a Cadillac SUV for years on the grounds that SUVs were Chevrolet and GMC territory, and that Cadillac would only make cars. The corporate logic was straightforward. General Motors maintained distinct identities for each of its divisions, and SUVs belonged to the truck-focused brands. Cadillac existed to make luxury sedans. That was the rule, and it had held for decades. Smith, who became head of Cadillac in 1997, had been quietly arguing against it from the moment he took the role. He believed Cadillac's continued retreat from cultural relevance was directly tied to its absence from the SUV segment that was reshaping American luxury preferences. He was right, but the internal battle to overturn General Motors' brand management orthodoxy took longer than the market was willing to wait. By 1997, with the Navigator selling strongly and Cadillac losing prestige to imports at an accelerating rate, Smith finally won the internal argument. But the approval came late, and the response had to be fast. The first-generation Escalade went into production approximately 10 months after it was approved, an unusually compressed timeline even by emergency product standards. Period Press reported it openly as a rapid response product, not a planned luxury SUV that happened to arrive 2 years after the Navigator. It was an urgent commitment built specifically because Lincoln had identified a market nobody else at General Motors had been allowed to pursue. Cadillac executives later acknowledged that General Motors had committed only about $10 million to the original Escalade program, a fraction of normal new model development budgets, and the first generation went on to generate roughly $200 million in profit, despite its compromised origins. The math justified everything that followed. Cadillac's approach was pragmatic rather than visionary. Rather than starting from a base Chevy Tahoe, Smith took the GMC Yukon Denali, already General Motors' top-trim full-size SUV, with upgraded interior, leather, and wood, and added Cadillac-specific exterior trim, badging, and a few interior touches like Zebrano wood accents. The first Escalade was, by every documented account, a slightly fancier Yukon Denali with Cadillac logos. Some period reviewers noted that the Escalade was missing features that had been standard on Cadillac since the early 1970s. Automatic climate control was absent at launch. The corners cut by the 10-month timeline were visible to anyone who knew where to look. The first Escalade arrived for the 1999 model year with a 5.7-liter Vortec V8, producing 255 horsepower. That was 25 horsepower more than the Navigator's 230 horsepower, and Cadillac made sure people knew it. The early advertising leaned on the power numbers. Reviewers got numbers they could compare directly. The Escalade looked aggressive next to the Navigator's restrained styling. It communicated dominance. It carried, almost from launch, a cultural energy that the Navigator, despite genuinely superior interior quality and platform sophistication, was not manufacturing. But the power gap was about to vanish. Lincoln had been watching too. The standard version of this story says Lincoln responded slowly to the Escalade by adding new cylinder heads to the 230 horsepower engine, eventually getting it to 300 horsepower as a late correction to an engineering oversight. That's not what actually happened. The real sequence was faster, more aggressive, and more interesting. At the start of the 1999 model year, Lincoln revised the existing 5.4-liter single overhead cam Triton from 230 to 260 horsepower, a modest update aimed at narrowing the power gap with the incoming Escalade. That alone would have been enough to put the Navigator within striking distance of the Cadillac on paper. But Lincoln did not stop there. As a running change during the 1999 model year, Lincoln replaced the Triton entirely with a different engine architecture. The new unit was a 5.4-liter dual overhead cam V8. Dual overhead cams instead of single, 4 valves per cylinder. A fundamentally more sophisticated head design. Lincoln branded it the InTech, borrowing the name from the Lincoln Mark 8 Coupe's V8 program that had been Lincoln's own performance engine identity through the early 1990s. The new engine produced 300 horsepower, a 45 horsepower jump over the revision at the start of the year, and 70 horsepower above the original 1998 specification. This was not a head revision. It was a complete engine swap to a more advanced architecture, executed mid-year, specifically to leapfrog the Escalade rather than match it. Lincoln did not just close the power gap. They opened a new one in their favor. By the end of 1999, the math had inverted from where it had started the year. The Navigator was making 300 horsepower. The Escalade was still making 255. That 45 horsepower advantage held through 2000 and 2001, the entire remaining lifespan of the first-generation Escalade. For roughly 2.5 years, the Navigator was substantially the more powerful vehicle, on top of being the more refined one. Period road tests confirmed it, 0 to 60 times for the InTech equipped. Navigator dropped into the low 8-second range. The Escalade trailed. This is the part of the story that gets lost in the standard narrative. Lincoln did not fail to respond to the Escalade. Lincoln responded faster and more aggressively than anyone expected, executed an engine swap inside a single model year that would normally have taken 18 months, and emerged with a vehicle that was technically superior to the competition by every measurable specification. The InTech name carried real meaning. It tied the Navigator back to the Mark VIII's performance heritage. The dual overhead cam architecture was genuinely more sophisticated than the Vortec pushrod Vive 8 in the Escalade. Lincoln was executing the engineering response correctly, but the Escalade had already won something engineering could not reverse. By the time Lincoln dropped the InTech in mid-1999, the Escalade had spent 6 months in the cultural conversation. Music videos, magazine covers that were not automotive magazines. The Escalade's silhouette had been absorbed by an audience that did not read Car and Driver and did not compare 0 to 60 times. That audience was not choosing the Escalade because it was faster. They were choosing the Escalade because it looked like the future of American luxury, and looking like the future was a position the Navigator had quietly conceded by choosing to be refined instead of aggressive in the first place. The fundamental difference between the two companies was not engineering capability. It was strategic insight. Lincoln had built what buyers objectively needed in a luxury SUV. Cadillac was building what buyers emotionally wanted to own. The distinction matters because it explains everything that followed. The Navigator's engineering choices were defensible at every level. The air suspension was real. The sound deadening was documented. The InTech V8, once it arrived, was genuinely more sophisticated than the Vortec. The platform was newer. The interior was tighter. Period reviewers consistently confirmed these advantages throughout 1999, 2000, and 2001. By every measurable engineering criterion, the Navigator was the better vehicle, but Cadillac had identified something Lincoln had not. The buyers who would shape American luxury desires in the late 1990s and the early 2000s were not going to make their decisions on engineering. They were going to make their decisions on presence, on stance, on what the vehicle communicated when it pulled up to a valet stand or appeared in a music video. The Escalade was being designed to win that competition, not the spec sheet competition. Hip-hop culture in the late 1990s was actively reshaping what American luxury looked like. The previous generation of luxury symbols, the Mercedes 560 SEL, the Cadillac Brougham, the Lincoln Town Car, was being replaced by something larger, taller, and more visually aggressive. The Navigator had arrived in 1997 at exactly the right moment to capture this shift. For the first 18 months, it largely did. Hip-hop artists drove Navigators. The vehicle appeared in music videos. The Lincoln logo carried weight in the cultural spaces where status was being constructed. Then the Escalade arrived, and the conversation shifted almost immediately. Cadillac's brand carried different cultural weight than Lincoln's. The Escalade's name, borrowed from the medieval siege tactic of scaling defensive walls, communicated something that the Navigator's nautical reference did not. The styling was more confrontational, the proportions were more deliberate, and critically, General Motors understood what was happening fast enough to lean into it. Cadillac's marketing started showing up in entertainment contexts that Lincoln did not pursue. Within 2 years of launch, the Escalade had displaced the Navigator as the cultural object of choice in the spaces where automotive status was actually being negotiated. Lincoln couldn't fix this with a faster engine. The InTech V8 was technically irrelevant to the cultural battle. By the time the Navigator was making 300 horsepower, The question of which vehicle made more horsepower had already stopped mattering to the buyers Cadillac was capturing. They weren't reading the spec sheets. They were watching what other people who shaped culture chose to drive. By 2002, Cadillac's strategy proved itself justified. The second-generation Escalade arrived with substantially different ambitions than the rushed first iteration. This wasn't a Yukon Denali with new badges anymore. General Motors had committed development resources that matched the product's commercial importance. The company understood it was competing for cultural authority in the luxury SUV space, and it was now willing to spend whatever the engineering side of that battle required. The new GMT 820 platform, a variant within the GMT 800 family, replaced the older GMT 400 architecture. The standard engine was a 5.3-liter V8, with an optional 6-liter Vortec producing 345 horsepower available as the upgrade. For buyers who chose the 6-liter, the Escalade now had a 45 horsepower advantage over the Navigator's InTech, exactly the same gap Lincoln had opened in the opposite direction 3 years earlier, now reversed. The interior quality moved closer to parity. The platform was newer. The engine narrative had been doing its work for almost 3 years by this point, and now the engineering finally matched. That combination was substantial enough to matter in real driving, not just in instrumented testing. 45 additional horsepower represented genuine capability, the kind of advantage drivers felt in acceleration and reviewers could measure and advertise prominently. Cadillac had closed every technical gap that had characterized the initial competitive years. Where the first-generation Escalade had been admittedly derivative, the second iteration was competitive across every measurable dimension, while remaining narratively superior in every dimension that did not show up on a spec sheet. By 2002, 5 years into the Navigator's original launch, the competitive landscape had fundamentally shifted. Lincoln's platform sharing strategy, which had enabled rapid and efficient development at launch, had also created an invisible structural ceiling. The Navigator could never be as differentiated or as committed to cultural positioning as a competitor that had finally received its parent company's full development backing. General Motors proved that, once it understood the market, it could build something the Navigator simply could not match. And it used the 18 months between the rushed first generation and the proper second one to absorb the cultural lessons that Lincoln had never quite articulated. The Navigator did not vanish from production once the Escalade's dominance became obvious. It continued through 2002, then transitioned to a second generation with revised exterior styling, an all-new independent rear suspension, and updated engine variants. The vehicle maintained a steady buyer base. It sold adequately, but it never reclaimed the unchallenged position it had held in 1998. What kept the Navigator viable in the long term was not cultural momentum. It was mechanical practicality. The 5.4-liter V8's deployment across the F-150, F-250, Expedition, and eventually the Mustang GT 500 created a parts ecosystem of enormous scale. Any Ford truck shop in North America had direct experience with the 5.4-liter engine. The documented failure modes were well-established problems with established repair procedures. Spark plug ejection, where the aluminum cylinder head's spark plug threads would strip under torque and allow the plug to blow out under compression, affected every 2-valve 5.4-liter application across Ford's lineup. Ford issued a technical service bulletin addressing it with a specific helicoil thread insert repair procedure. The bulletin was documented across F-150, Expedition, Navigator, and E-Series van applications, confirming the issue as a cylinder head architecture characteristic rather than an assembly defect specific to any model. When a Navigator owner needed engine work, they were not drawing on a limited service supply calibrated for Navigator volume. They were accessing infrastructure built for millions of Ford trucks. The 4R100 transmission followed the same pattern. Heavy-duty Ford truck deployment across the F-250 and F-350 created a massive rebuild ecosystem. Transmission service for the Navigator meant accessing a supply chain calibrated for Super Duty demand. The Navigator survived as a usable vehicle, not because it was culturally prominent, but because it shared mechanical DNA with vehicles that sold in far greater numbers. The air-rear suspension remained the Navigator's most persistent ownership challenge. Documented failures followed the same aging pattern as similar systems in Mercedes and Cadillac vehicles. air spring bladder degradation, compressor wear from running excessively to maintain pressure in degraded bags, and height sensor failure. These problems accumulated as the vehicle aged, but the owner community developed a documented solution. Aftermarket conversion kits emerged that replaced the pneumatic airbags with conventional coil springs, priced at roughly $200 to $400 for the hardware. The conversion eliminated the failure mode entirely at the cost of the original load leveling function. The fact that a commercially available, purpose-built conversion kit exists for this specific failure is itself the documentation. The failure was predictable enough and common enough to sustain dedicated aftermarket development. What sustained the Navigator's presence in the used market, though, had less to do with engineering and more to do with timing. The late 1990s Navigator carried cultural associations that period road tests did not measure. In hip-hop culture, in music videos, and in entertainment media, the Navigator appeared as a specific cultural marker before the Escalade arrived to displace it. That 18-month window of cultural primacy left a residue. Buyers in the used market years later were not simply purchasing a mechanical object, they were purchasing a reference to a moment when the Navigator briefly defined what American luxury looked like. That association contributed to used market values that exceeded what comparable utility trucks achieved. The first-generation Navigator's exterior design also aged unusually well. Clean lines, proportions that did not look dated. The exterior wore time gracefully compared to other vehicles from the same period, but aging well aesthetically did not reverse the fundamental shift in market position. The Navigator was the truck that had created the segment. The Escalade was the truck that ended up owning it. The Navigator's outcome documents something that conventional business wisdom often gets wrong. Creating a market segment and dominating one require genuinely different skills. And being right about engineering is no defense against being wrong about culture. The Navigator created the American full-size luxury SUV segment by recognizing an opportunity others had not yet pursued, and by filling it with competent engineering and intelligent positioning. Lincoln identified a specific market gap, developed a product that closed it, and priced it to make the value proposition obvious. The execution worked, and the market validated the choice immediately. Then Lincoln defended its position with exactly the kind of aggressive engineering response that should have worked, bumping the Triton mid-year and installing a more sophisticated double overhead cam engine within a single model year, specifically to leapfrog the competition. By every standard measure of how a manufacturer is supposed to defend a category it created, Lincoln did the right things at the right times. It did not matter. Cadillac was playing a different game. The 18-month window between the Navigator's launch and the Escalade's arrival was enough for Cadillac to identify what buyers were actually going to want as the segment matured, and Cadillac understood, sooner than Lincoln did, that the answer was not more horsepower or better sound deadening. It was visual dominance, cultural alignment, and a brand that could absorb hip-hop's shift in luxury vocabulary without seeming to be trying. Lincoln spent 1999 winning the engineering battle. Cadillac spent the same period winning the only battle that would matter in the long run. The lesson embedded in this outcome extends beyond the Navigator and Escalade themselves. Market leadership in luxury automotive flows through cultural channels more than through engineering ones. The vehicle that the market perceives as the status object becomes the market leader, regardless of whether its engineering justifies the perception. The Navigator had created the category by identifying what buyers needed. The Escalade had claimed the category by understanding what buyers wanted to be seen owning. Lincoln had been right about everything that could be measured and wrong about the one thing that could not. The Navigator proved Ford could build a luxury truck. The Escalade proved Cadillac understood what luxury was about to mean. Both statements are true. Both companies executed their strategies correctly. Only one of them had picked the strategy that mattered. Now, click on this next video about the Lincoln Town Car. That sedan defined American luxury for an entire generation, long before the Navigator was even on the drawing board.